Sarah Mitchell pressed her palm against the cool glass of the train window, watching the endless prairie roll past in waves of golden grass. At 23 years old, she was leaving everything she knew behind: the cramped tenement in Philadelphia, the factory where lint filled her lungs 12 hours a day, and the gnawing hunger that had become her constant companion. In her worn leather satchel lay a single letter, creased from countless readings, promising a fresh start as the wife of a prosperous rancher named Thomas Garrett in the Dakota Territory. The year was 1876, and mail-order marriages had become a lifeline for women like Sarah. She had no family left. Her mother had died from consumption 2 years ago, and her father had perished in a factory accident when she was just 16. The marriage broker had shown her Thomas's photograph, a stern-faced man with a thick mustache and cold eyes that should have warned her. But desperation has a way of blinding people to danger. As the train lurched westward, Sarah rehearsed the lies she would tell her new husband. She would pretend to be educated, refined, everything the advertisement had promised. She had taught herself to read using discarded newspapers and could write well enough to compose the letters Thomas had received. The broker had helped embellish the rest, describing Sarah as the daughter of a deceased merchant rather than a factory girl who had scrubbed floors to survive. The landscape grew wilder with each passing mile. Forests gave way to plains, and civilized towns became scattered outposts clinging to the edge of wilderness. Sarah felt the knot in her stomach tighten. She had gambled everything on this journey, spending her last coins on a decent dress and the train fare. There was no going back now, even if she wanted to. When the train finally shuddered to a stop at a ramshackle station that could barely be called a town, Sarah gathered her belongings with trembling hands. The platform was nearly deserted except for a tall man in a black coat standing beside a wagon. His face matched the photograph, but the picture had somehow failed to capture the cruelty etched into every line of his features. Thomas Garrett did not smile when he saw her. His eyes traveled over her body like she was livestock at auction, assessing her worth with a gaze that made her skin crawl. He nodded once, a curt acknowledgement that she would suffice, and gestured toward the wagon without offering to help with her bag. The ride to his ranch took 3 hours through increasingly desolate country. Thomas spoke only to issue commands about how she would be expected to behave. She would cook, clean, mend, and tend the chickens. She would speak only when spoken to. She would bear him sons. His voice was flat, mechanical, as if he were describing the care of farm equipment rather than a marriage. Sarah's heart sank lower with every word, but she kept her face carefully neutral. She had survived worse, she told herself. Working fingers to bone in the factory, sleeping in a boarding house infested with rats, eating nothing but bread and weak tea for days on end. Surely she could endure this too. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was a collection of weathered buildings surrounded by barbed wire fencing. Everything looked gray and cheerless under the overcast sky. Thomas led her inside a house that smelled of mildew and unwashed dishes. The single room served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom, with a curtain providing the only privacy. That first night, Thomas made his expectations brutally clear. Sarah was property he had purchased, nothing more. When she tried to speak, to ask about her duties or learn something about her new life, he struck her across the face with the back of his hand. The blow sent her sprawling against the rough wooden wall. As she lay there tasting blood, Sarah realized the horrible truth. She had not escaped hell by coming west. She had simply traded one prison for another, and this one was far more isolated, far more dangerous. There would be no neighbors to hear her screams, no police to intervene, no escape in the endless miles of empty prairie. She was completely, utterly alone with a monster who now owned her by law. The promise of a new life had been nothing but a beautiful lie, and she had walked into this trap with her eyes wide shut. The first weeks of marriage taught Sarah the true meaning of suffering. Thomas's cruelty was systematic and deliberate, designed to break her spirit as one might break a wild horse. He rationed her food, giving her barely enough to sustain herself while he ate his fill. When the work was not done to his impossible standards, his fists provided education. Sarah learned to move silently through the house, to anticipate his moods, to make herself as invisible as possible. The isolation was almost worse than the violence. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and Thomas made it clear that if she ever tried to run, he would hunt her down and make her regret it. He kept the only horse locked in the barn, and even if she could steal it, where would she go? The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, and winter was coming fast. Sarah discovered she was not Thomas's first mail-order bride. While cleaning out a trunk in the barn, she found a bundle of letters addressed to a woman named Catherine. The correspondence ended abruptly 2 years ago, and when Sarah asked Thomas about her predecessor, his silence was more terrifying than any answer could have been. That night, she noticed a small cross planted behind the chicken coop, weathered and unmarked. October brought the first serious cold, and with it, Thomas's drinking intensified. He would ride to town and return with bottles of whiskey that transformed him from cruel to savage. On those nights, Sarah would hide in the barn, pressing herself into the hay while he raged through the house, breaking furniture and screaming threats into the darkness. But Sarah had not survived the Philadelphia slums by being weak. Each day of abuse hardened something inside her, forged her into steel. She began planning. She watched the patterns of Thomas's behavior, noted when he was most drunk and vulnerable, where he kept money, how to saddle the horse. She was not Catherine, whoever that poor woman had been. She would not end up beneath an unmarked cross. Her opportunity came on a bitter November night when Thomas returned from town barely able to stand. He had lost money gambling, she could smell it on him along with the whiskey and cheap perfume. His rage that night was apocalyptic. He grabbed Sarah by her hair and dragged her across the floor, screaming obscenities, his spittle flecking her face. Something inside Sarah finally snapped. When he drew back his fist for another blow, she grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung with all the strength desperation could provide. The impact made a sickening thud, and Thomas crumpled like a puppet with cut strings. For a long moment, Sarah stood frozen, the skillet still raised, not knowing if she had killed him. Then Thomas groaned, and she saw her chance. She grabbed her cloak, some bread, and the small amount of money she found in his coat. Her hands shook as she saddled the horse, certain at any moment he would appear in the barn doorway. She rode into the night with no destination, only the desperate need to put distance between herself and that house of horrors. The temperature was dropping fast, and she had no proper winter clothing, but fear drove her forward. Behind her, she thought she heard Thomas's roar of fury, though it might have been only the wind. Sarah rode until the horse was stumbling with exhaustion and she could no longer feel her fingers gripping the reins. Dawn found her in unfamiliar territory, following a frozen creek through hills covered in pine trees. She had no idea where she was going, only that she could never go back. Then the horse stepped wrong, its hoof finding a hole hidden beneath snow. The animal went down with a scream, and Sarah was thrown hard against frozen ground. She felt something in her ankle snap, and pain exploded up her leg. The horse struggled to rise but could not, its leg clearly broken. Sarah knew what had to be done, but she had no gun, no way to end the animal's suffering or her own. She crawled away from the dying horse and found shelter beneath an overhanging rock. Her ankle was swelling rapidly, and blood from a gash on her forehead kept running into her eyes. The sky was growing dark again, and snow had begun to fall. She had escaped Thomas only to die alone in the wilderness. As consciousness began to fade, Sarah thought she saw figures moving through the trees. Probably hallucinations, she thought, or perhaps wolves coming to finish what cold and injury had started. She closed her eyes and waited for whatever end the frontier had decided for her. She had tried to find freedom, but the West had proven just as merciless as everything else. Sarah woke to warmth and the smell of burning sage. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on a ceiling made of stretched hide and wooden poles. She was lying on soft furs, covered with blankets she did not recognize. Panic surged through her, and she tried to sit up, but pain lanced through her ankle and head, forcing her back down. A face appeared above her, a woman with dark eyes, bronze skin, and black hair streaked with gray. She spoke in a language Sarah did not understand, her tone soothing as she pressed a cool cloth to Sarah's forehead. Sarah tried to speak, to ask where she was, but her throat was too dry. The woman lifted a cup to her lips, and Sarah drank gratefully, tasting herbs and something slightly bitter. Over the following days, Sarah learned she had been found by a hunting party from a Lakota band. They had heard the horse screaming and found her unconscious in the snow, near death from cold and injury. Against what Sarah would later understand were significant objections from some tribe members, they had brought her to their winter camp. The woman caring for her was named Winona, a healer whose husband had died the previous winter. Through gestures and simple words, they began to communicate. Winona set Sarah's broken ankle, wrapped her head wound with poultices that reduced the swelling, and fed her soup made from venison and wild roots. Sarah had expected to be treated as a prisoner or worse, but instead she found kindness she had not known existed. As Sarah healed, she became aware of the debates her presence caused. She could not understand the words, but she recognized the heated discussions, the glances cast in her direction. Some wanted her sent away as soon as she could travel. Others argued for keeping her until spring. The decision, she gradually understood, rested with someone she had not yet met, the chief. 3 weeks after her rescue, Sarah was strong enough to leave the teepee. She emerged into a winter camp of perhaps 30 lodges, smoke rising from their peaks into the crystalline air. Children playing in the snow stopped to stare at her. Women working on hides paused their scraping. She felt like an exotic and possibly dangerous creature that had wandered into their midst. Then she saw him. He stood near the central fire, taller than the other men, wearing buckskin decorated with quillwork and holding himself with unmistakable authority. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the intelligence in his eyes and the scars that marked him as a warrior. This was clearly the chief, and he was looking directly at her. Winona appeared at Sarah's elbow and guided her forward. Sarah's injured ankle made her limp, but she tried to walk with dignity. When they reached the chief, Winona spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing to Sarah. The chief listened without expression, his dark eyes studying Sarah with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. He spoke, his voice deep and measured. Winona translated haltingly, mixing Lakota, broken English, and gestures. The chief's name was Tahatan, which meant his hawk. He wanted to know why a white woman was alone in winter, injured and fleeing. He wanted to know if soldiers would come searching for her. Sarah understood the real question beneath his words. Was she a danger to his people? In that moment, she made a choice to tell the truth. Through Winona's translation, she explained about the marriage broker, about Thomas's cruelty, about Catherine's unmarked grave. She showed them the fading bruises on her arms, the scar where Thomas's ring had split her lip. As she spoke, something changed in Tahatan's expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke again, and even before Winona translated, Sarah could hear the decision in his tone. She could stay until spring. She would work to earn her place, helping the women with their tasks, but she would be protected. No harm would come to her here. That night, lying in Winona's teepee and listening to the wind outside, Sarah cried for the first time since leaving Philadelphia. But these were not tears of despair. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. These people who owed her nothing, whose language she did not speak, whose ways were foreign to her, had shown her more humanity than her own husband ever had. She did not know yet that this was only the beginning, that the stern chief with the scarred face and watchful eyes would change her life in ways she could not imagine. She knew only that she had been found when she was lost, given shelter when she was dying, and offered kindness when she expected none. In fleeing hell, she had stumbled into something unexpected. Winter deepened, and Sarah became part of the daily rhythm of the Lakota camp. Winona taught her with patient gestures and simple words, showing her how to scrape hides until they were soft as cloth, how to sew moccasins with sinew thread, how to prepare pemmican by pounding dried meat with berries and fat. The work was hard, but it was honest labor done among women who laughed while they worked, so different from the grim silence of Thomas's house. The children were fascinated by Sarah's pale skin and light brown hair. They would touch it shyly, giggling when she smiled at them. A girl of about 7 named Zitkala took special interest in her, chattering constantly in Lakota and patiently teaching Sarah words. Through Zitkala, Sarah learned the names of things: water, fire, snow, stars. Language built bridges where before there had been only silence. But it was Tahatan who occupied Sarah's thoughts more than she wanted to admit. She would see him throughout the camp, always watching, always aware of everything happening among his people. He checked on the elderly, settled disputes, planned hunts, and ensured everyone had enough food for winter. She noticed how young warriors sought his counsel, how mothers brought sick children to him for advice, how his presence brought order and calm. He also watched Sarah. She would feel his gaze on her while she worked, not threatening but assessing, as if trying to understand this strange white woman who had fallen into his care. Sometimes in the evenings, he would come to Winona's teepee and they would talk in Lakota while Sarah pretended not to notice. She caught her name in their conversations and wondered what was being said. One afternoon, while Sarah was struggling to carry water from the frozen stream, Tahatan appeared beside her. Without speaking, he took the heavy containers from her hands and carried them back to camp. Sarah followed, acutely aware of the eyes watching them, the whispers this would generate. At Winona's teepee, he set down the water and then, for the first time, spoke directly to Sarah in careful English. "Your ankle. Still pain?" His accent was thick, but the words were clear. Sarah was so surprised she almost could not answer. She had not known he spoke any English at all. "Better now. Thank you." She gestured to the water, to him, feeling awkward and strange. He nodded, studying her face. "You were married to bad man. White men, many are bad to women. I have seen this." There was no judgment in his voice, only statement of fact. "Here, you are safe. Understand?" "I understand. Thank you, Tahatan." Using his name felt intimate somehow, and she saw something flicker in his eyes at the sound of it. After that, things shifted subtly. Tahatan would find reasons to be near where Sarah worked. He brought her a warmer blanket when the temperature dropped. He showed her how to pack snow around the teepee base for better insulation. Their conversations were simple, limited by language, but Sarah began to see past the stern chief to the man beneath. She learned he had lost his wife 3 years ago to a white man's disease, smallpox that swept through the plains leaving devastation. He had loved her deeply, and her death had left him alone with their son, a boy of 10 named Chaitan. She learned that Tahatan had fought to keep his people free, that he bore scars from battles with both enemy tribes and U.S. soldiers. He had seen his world changing, shrinking, and was trying desperately to protect what remained. Sarah found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. About her parents' deaths, about the grinding poverty of Philadelphia, about how she had taught herself to read by candlelight after exhausting factory shifts. About her dreams of a different life, and how those dreams had led her into Thomas's trap. Tahatan listened with absolute attention, never interrupting, his respect for her story evident in his stillness. The camp began to notice the time they spent together. Winona watched with knowing eyes but said nothing. Some of the younger warriors looked displeased, perhaps hoping their chief would choose one of the Lakota widows or unmarried women. But no one challenged Tahatan's choices. One night, during a rare moment alone near the fire, Tahatan spoke quietly in a mixture of Lakota and English, with Winona nearby to help translate the harder parts. He told Sarah that in his culture, a man proved his worth through actions, not words. He told her that strength came in many forms, and surviving what she had survived showed a warrior's heart. He told her that the color of skin mattered less than the content of spirit. Then he said something that made Sarah's breath catch. He said that when spring came, she could leave if she wished. He would give her supplies and a horse, help her reach a town where white people lived. But he hoped, and here his voice grew softer, that she might choose to stay. Not as a guest, not as someone merely tolerated, but as someone who belonged. Sarah looked into his eyes and saw something she had never expected to see again, the possibility of love without fear, partnership without domination, a future built on respect rather than ownership. Her heart, which she had thought frozen beyond recovery, began to thaw. But she was afraid too, terrified of trusting, of believing that happiness might actually be possible for someone like her. Spring came late to the plains that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed everything. Ice melted into rushing streams, grass pushed through thawing earth, and the world exploded into life and color. The Lakota prepared to leave their winter camp, and Sarah knew her decision could not be delayed any longer. Thomas still existed somewhere in the world, legally her husband, perhaps searching for her or perhaps grateful to be rid of her. The white settlements offered a return to her own culture, to people who spoke her language and shared her history. Leaving would be the sensible choice, the safe choice. But safety, Sarah had learned, was not the same thing as home. She found Tahatan on a hill overlooking the camp, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. He did not turn when she approached, but she knew he was aware of her presence. Sarah stood beside him in silence, gathering her courage. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "If you truly meant the offer, I want to stay here, with your people. With you." Tahatan turned to face her fully, and Sarah saw in his expression a mixture of joy and solemnity. "You understand what this means? White people will not accept you anymore. You will be treated as Lakota, as enemy. My people, some will always see you as outsider. This path is not easy." "Nothing in my life has been easy," Sarah replied. "But here, I have found kindness. I have found purpose. I have found." She hesitated, then continued, "I have found you. That is worth any hardship." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand. His palm was calloused from years of holding weapons and reins, warm and strong. "In my culture," he said carefully, "marriage is not ownership. It is partnership. Two people choosing to walk together, each keeping their own strength, their own spirit. Is this something you can believe in?" Sarah thought of Thomas, who had seen her as property to be used and discarded. Then she looked at Tahatan, who had protected her, respected her, and asked rather than demanded. "Yes," she said. "I can believe in that." The marriage ceremony was simple but profound. Tahatan gave horses to Winona, honoring her as Sarah's adoptive mother. Sarah wore a dress of soft doeskin that the women had helped her make, decorated with beadwork and quills and patterns that told the story of her journey from east to west, from captivity to freedom. Tahatan stood before the entire tribe and spoke of Sarah's courage, her willingness to learn Lakota ways, and his commitment to honor and protect her. When they exchanged vows in a mixture of English and Lakota, Sarah felt something shift in her soul. This was not a legal ceremony by white law, but it was more real than anything that had happened in Thomas's house. This was a covenant made freely, witnessed by stars and people, bound by genuine love rather than desperate necessity. The following months brought challenges Sarah had not anticipated. Learning to live as Lakota meant more than speaking the language or wearing their clothes. It meant understanding a completely different worldview, different spiritual beliefs, different relationships with the land and animals. Some tribe members remained skeptical of her, testing her commitment through subtle slights and difficulties. But Sarah had survived worse, and now she had Tahatan beside her. He was a patient teacher and gentle husband. He showed her how to ride like Lakota women rode, how to read weather in cloud formations, how to find medicine plants on the prairie. She taught him to read English, writing words in the dirt with sticks, opening up new worlds of understanding between their cultures. Together, they learned that love could bridge even the widest chasms. Sarah became a mother to Chaitan, who had initially been wary of this white woman in his father's life. But time and genuine affection won him over, and the day he first called her mother in Lakota was one of the happiest of her life. When she discovered she was carrying Tahatan's child, the joy in the camp was genuine and widespread. Years would pass, bringing both hardship and beauty. The pressure on Lakota people would increase, forcing difficult choices and painful compromises. But through it all, Sarah would remain by Tahatan's side, her strength complementing his, her perspective helping navigate impossible situations. Together, they would raise children who belonged to both worlds and to neither, who carried the best of two cultures in their hearts. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Sarah would remember the frightened girl who had stepped off the train into Thomas Garrett's cruel hands. She would remember the desperation, the pain, the certainty that her life would end badly. Then she would look at Tahatan across the fire, at Chaitan teaching his younger siblings to track rabbits, at the community that had become her family, and she would marvel at the strange journey that had brought her here. She had been a mail-order bride who found hell, but in fleeing that darkness, she had stumbled into heaven. Not the heaven of churches and hymns, but something more real, a heaven made of genuine love, mutual respect, shared purpose, and the freedom to be fully herself. It was a heaven she had helped create, fought for, and earned. And it was enough.